Welcome everyone. My name is Matthew Rose from Brave New Europe. I'd especially like to thank Vinh Tho for giving this talk this evening. We've waited about 4 years for this to happen, so we're very, very pleased that he's joined us. I'd also like to thank the two interpreters, Florian and Oscar, and of course, as always, Helle Panke and Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, who make these events possible. At the end, I'm supposed to tell you, you can support Helle Panke with these Zoomcasts. If you go onto the website, there's a PayPal button and you go there. All right, I keep the introductions short. I'll do that again. First of all, this is the first talk in our autumn 2021 series of Economics Beyond the Swabian Hausfrau, which I think in the meantime, we probably could rename Climate Change Beyond Capitalism. I imagine many of us are here because I think we are on a very long, arduous journey in the struggle against climate change and the causes of it, which I don't think anyone's disputing anymore. It's man-made, but it's also economically made. What we're trying to do in this series is bring in what we refer to as guides, in the sense that these are people who have probably pretty well covered segments of the journey which lie ahead of us and can help us along with their experience and, if I may call it, wisdom. And we'll continue this. We're going to have Robin McAlpine and we're also going to have Julia Steinberger in November, so please join us then. That's about it on the introduction. Tho, you have the word.
Thank you, Matthew. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having invited me tonight to join this online conference. My name is Vinh Tho, and I'll just say a few words about myself before I begin with the actual talk, so that you know where I'm speaking from, so to say. So actually, my talk is about happiness and well-being as a new development paradigm. But the reason why I got interested in happiness and well-being is because I witnessed a lot of suffering in several stages of my life. I'm half Vietnamese originally, and as the elders among you might remember, we've had a 30 years long war in Vietnam. And later I worked with the International Committee of the Red Cross, and I spent quite a lot of time in war zones. And therefore I witnessed a lot of human suffering and also the destruction of the environment and nature, which one doesn't necessarily think about when one thinks about war, but that is as real as also the human suffering. And so when I got the chance to join the Gross National Happiness Center in Bhutan after my time in the International Committee of the Red Cross, it was quite a stark transition from spending a lot of my time in war zones to being in the so-called happiness country. And for me, it began in 2012. So in 2011, the royal government of Bhutan had submitted a resolution to the United Nations called Happiness and Wellbeing as a New Development Paradigm. Originally, it was even called as a new economic paradigm, but there was a kind of a pushback against that. And so it changed to a new development paradigm. And the resolution was adopted in July 2011. And that led the royal government of Bhutan to host a so-called high-level meeting in New York at the United Nations in 2012. And the then Prime Minister of Bhutan, Jigme Thinley, decided to create a gross national happiness center to help with the organization of this event, and then later also to develop further gross national happiness. And I then had the job as director of the Gross National Happiness Center. So that was just a few words of introduction, and now I will begin with the actual talk. So I hope my screen is well shared. So gross national happiness, a new development paradigm, and the subtitle is the inner and outer conditions of happiness and well-being. And when we speak of happiness and well-being, usually the first question is, how can you replace something as practical and measurable as gross domestic product, GDP, with something as vague and subjective as happiness or gross national happiness. So I think we might first want to look a little bit at what do we mean with happiness when we speak about gross national happiness. And first of all, it's interesting to notice that the idea of happiness as a central dimension of human life can be found in most wisdom traditions of the world, both East and West. I've just took a few out. The first one is from Aristotle. Happiness is the meaning and the purpose of life, the whole aim and end of human existence. So Greek philosophy. And then something coming from the East that was quoted by His Holiness Dalai Lama, but based on Buddhist wisdom tradition. True happiness comes from having a sense of inner peace and contentment, which in turn must be achieved by cultivating altruism, love and compassion, and by eliminating anger, selfishness, and greed. So according to the Buddhist tradition, it becomes a bit more specific. And one sees it has a lot to do with the more inner dimension of happiness. And we will speak tonight both about the inner and the outer dimensions of happiness. And then finally, for the German speakers among you, Hallo nach Berlin, a quote from Goethe: Das Glück ist nicht einer kurzlebigen Freude gleichzusetzen. Es ist vielmehr eine geheime, ein ganzes Leben lang wirkende Kraft. So now I would actually need the translators to do a reverse translating. I'll do my best. So happiness is not to be equated with a short-lived happiness, pleasure. It is much more a secret force that works throughout the whole life. So these three quotes, Dalai Lama's quote, Goethe's quote, and Aristotle's quotes, point out towards a fundamental difference between two ways of understanding happiness that the ancient Greek philosophy described as hedonism versus eudaimonia. So hedonism is pleasure, superficial happiness, the ups and downs of our emotional life. And of course, this is very subjective, very personal, and we don't want the state or our boss to tell us what should make us happy in the sense of hedonism. So it's a very personal choice, and the last thing we want is that the state would mix in our choices about what is for us sources of pleasures. But the kind of happiness that comes from hedonism or pleasures, they are usually short-lived. They cannot be sustained. Like, let's take the example of, let's say you like very nice food, and you go for a dinner and you have an exquisite gastronomic experience, and it can be a real pleasure and can really make you feel happy. But obviously, if it would go on and you would continue eating more and more, the pleasure would sooner or later turn into suffering. And we see that with all the phenomenon around addiction, how the quest for so-called happiness or superficial pleasure actually can lead to very deep suffering. While the idea of eudaimonia comes from eu, which means beautiful or harmonious, and daimonia doesn't mean the demon, but it's what for Plato is our true being, our higher self, our entelechy. And so this kind of happiness means to live in harmony with our true self, with our deepest, highest aspiration as individuals and as society. So it's not the superficial pleasures that come and go, the superficial moods that come and go, but it's rather reflecting what are the inner and outer conditions that will allow us as individuals, as organizations, as societies, to truly flourish, to have the best possible life that enables us to unfold and manifest our full potential. So this is the kind of happiness we're speaking about. Obviously, also when Aristotle says happiness is the meaning and the purpose of life, the whole aim and end of human existence, is not talking about superficial pleasures. And likewise, when the Dalai Lama speaks of happiness coming from a sense from inner peace and contentment, it has to do with the feeling that we are leading a meaningful life that is aligned with all our values. And he speaks about altruism. It means that true happiness also is connected with the feeling that I can contribute to society or support my fellow human beings. And love and compassion are the forces that we can cultivate and help us have this harmonious relationship with our fellow human beings. And then it's also about transforming these inner tendencies that create suffering, like anger, selfishness, and greed. And so obviously when we speak about Goethe's definition that true happiness is not a short-lived pleasure, but it's something that really goes throughout our life, we are referring to the same dimension. And this is obviously what was meant by the government, the royal government of Bhutan, when here the Prime Minister of Bhutan at the United Nations in New York came with this proposal, with this resolution, let's put happiness and well-being at the center of development. So I will first speak a little bit about gross national happiness, the way it was developed in Bhutan, and then we will see how it can apply not only in Bhutan, but also in Europe for the time being. So the first insight is that true happiness needs both inner and outer conditions. So I've put up this famous yin-yang symbol from the Chinese or Eastern tradition that shows the connection between the inner and the outer, and how the two, the inner and the outer, are not disconnected, but always interactive with one another, interdependent. And so we believe that when we speak about true happiness, we have to look at the balance between inner and outer conditions. One criticism that has been made, and I think it's a rightful criticism of the so-called happiness trend, is that the danger is that if we only look at the inner conditions of happiness, then we put the whole burden on the individual. And that somehow is in line with the more neoliberal, individualistic Western view. And, you know, like, okay, if you're stressed out, then maybe you should do a bit of relaxation or a bit of meditation or whatever. It's your responsibility, without seeing that more often than not, the causes are also structural or systemic, let's say in the way our environment or workplace organizations are functioning. So that would be one extreme, to only look at the inner dimension, forgetting that we also need to transform the outer dimension. Now, when we only look at the outer dimension, we want system change, we want structural change, we want political change, fair enough, and we definitely need that. And I believe that the time we're living in, with what we experienced during this pandemic, showed the limits of the current systems. But we also know from a lot of experience that if you just change the outer system without changing the inner dimension, the consciousness, sooner or later we come back to same old, same old. Why? Because organizations, systems, structures are neither God-given, nor are they natural laws. They are made by the way we think, feel, act, relate with one another, relate with our environment, relate with our planet. So the systems are like a manifestation of human consciousness. Therefore, if consciousness doesn't change, sooner or later, we will end up with having the same systems. Therefore, the importance of balancing inner and outer conditions. The way we have tried to summarize the three main components of true happiness is by naming it, first of all, living in harmony with oneself. This is taking the time to look within, to slow down, and to reflect. What is truly important for me? What are my values? What are my deepest aspirations? What are my priorities in life? And trying to build our life around these deepest aspirations and most important priorities. So there's a dimension of self-knowledge, of self-management, but also of self-transformation, and I will speak a bit more of that a bit later, about that a bit later. The second dimension is living in harmony with others. And we have a lot of scientific evidence showing that the main cause of happiness and of unhappiness is the quality of our relationship with others. So we all know from experience that we might be in a very beautiful environment. Let's say we are taking holidays in a beautiful hotel by the ocean, and the weather is wonderful, and the food is great, and the hotel is comfortable. But we have a fight with our partner, then very soon the paradise can transform into hell. So the outer conditions will not be enough if the quality of human relationship is not there. And we know also from work situation that there might be different causes for stress and burnout, but definitely the factor that has the strongest impact on stress and burnout is when there is conflict within the team, bad relationship, the feeling that I'm not acknowledged, that I'm not perceived, that I have no agency, and so on. So the quality of human relationships is absolutely central to our own happiness and well-being. And thirdly, and this has become more and more important, obviously, now that the ecological crisis, climate change, and so on has become such a prominent problem and challenge for us as a humankind. Living in harmony with nature and with the planet is the very foundation of any sustainable happiness and well-being for humans and for all other life forms. So this is in a nutshell what we speak about when we speak about happiness in the context of gross national happiness. And I would like to say just a few words about gross national happiness. So this is the fourth king of Bhutan, Chigme Singye Wanchuk. He was 17 years old when he became when he had to ascend the throne because his father had passed away. And so he was very young, but he was quite a wise young man because he realized that he didn't know what he should do. Bhutan at that time was still an absolute monarchy, meaning that the king had absolute power. And he knew that he was there to serve his people, but he didn't know what would be the best way to do so. And so for about 2 years, he traveled around Bhutan, mostly by foot. In these days, that was 1972, there were very few roads in Bhutan and even less motor vehicles. And for about 2 years, he listened to the people. Now, I think that's a really important factor, because when we think of leadership, more often than not, we speak about those who are in charge and tell others what to do. But I believe that true leadership, and that was the example that His Majesty the Fourth King gave, begins with being able to listen to what people really want and need. And so that's what the young king did. And when he came back to his palace, he assembled his advisors, and he said, you know, it's not easy because many people want many different things. You know, young people, elder people, men, women, city dwellers, and people in the countryside. Not everybody has the same expectation. But what I noticed, what is common to everyone wants to be happy, wants their loved ones to be happy, and everyone hopes to escape suffering, and that their loved one is free of suffering. So he decided that his government would have as highest priority to bring happiness to the country. Now, that's a very nice ideal, but how do you do that practically? It doesn't seem that practical. It seems a little bit like a dream or utopia or something very unrealistic. And so the whole work that has been done between 1972 until 2011, when the royal government of Bhutan brought the resolution of gross national happiness to the UN, was to try to find practical ways. How do you put happiness at the center of all government action and decisions? So I will show you a little film that that we did when I was in Bhutan together with my colleague, Dr. Julia Kim, where we tried to share some of these insights. And at the same time, it gives you the opportunity to see a few pictures of Bhutan.
The message that I'd like to share about gross national happiness is that it's not just about Bhutan, and that it's not just about happiness in a very superficial way. It's really about the deep-seated causes of happiness and well-being that come from living in harmony with nature, in harmony and balance with others around you, and really being in touch with yourself and your own wisdom. That transcends any culture or country boundary, and it's really central to our own personal happiness and to, I think, our survival as a planet.
GNH is a kind of a medicine, if you want, for the illness of our times. The first message of GNH, I believe, is reconnecting with our natural environment in such a way that we acknowledge, respect, and value the sacredness of all life forms and our interconnectedness with all life forms. The second crisis that we are facing as a mankind is an economic crisis, which is actually more of an ethical, of a moral crisis than an actual economic crisis. Therefore, we see rising inequality, not only between North and South, but even within rich societies. So the second message is about creating a caring economy, an economy that is based on values like altruism and compassion, and collaboration, solidarity, rather than competition and destruction of the environment. The third message of GNH, I believe, is reconnecting with ourselves, with our deepest or highest potential, with our deepest values. Because a lot of the dissatisfaction and meaninglessness that we experience in modern life is the direct consequence of this disconnection with ourselves.
I think one reason that gross national happiness has come into the spotlight in a global way right now is because there's a collective sense that things aren't working. I don't think we would be so interested in happiness if we weren't really feeling unhappy with a lot of things right now. So I think what Gnh offers is not just a cosmetic stick-on band-aid solution to just tweak the system a little bit. It's really questioning, why have we been chasing GDP and economic growth at all costs? And can we not balance that and look at happiness and well-being of all life as a reason and the center for development?
So, as I was mentioning before,
Excuse me, To, we're going to have a brief 10-second break because the interpreters are changing now. For the audience, questions you won't be able to be seen or heard, but you can put your questions on the chat button at the bottom, at the very middle. You'll see a chat. Just click on there, and then you start putting in questions for Q&A after the talk. So that's it. Let's continue. Thank you, To.
So as I was mentioning, the challenge really was to translate kind of an idealistic vision of saying, okay, we want to have happiness and well-being at the center of our government action into a practical framework that would enable government, organization, ministries, but also businesses and schools to really put into practice this idea of gross national happiness. And so what I'm showing you is a kind of a framework that we came up with to try to make visible what we're speaking about. So the goal is societal happiness. That's the goal. Now, in order to reach that goal, what we need to do is we need to be able to fulfill the legitimate human needs. So as Gandhi was saying, nature can give enough to meet everybody's needs, but not everybody's wants or desires. So we need to also define what are legitimate human needs. And so regardless of the environment in which we live, require adequate satisfaction of their need for food, water, shelter, security, and respect, and so on. All of this in turn is dependent upon a sustainable environment. And this is why you have this green line around it. And this green line is planetary boundaries. So how can we meet legitimate human needs without overstepping planetary boundaries? And one of the dimensions that is important is to realize that human needs are not only material. And Western society has focused very much on the material dimension of human needs. And more often than not, psychological needs, cultural needs, even spiritual needs have not been taken into consideration as much as the purely material needs. And no doubt, the material basic needs like need for food, water, shelter, and so on must be a priority. But as soon as these are covered, then we need to look deeper. So that's the box A with the needs. The box B is the holistic development agenda, and that's very important because that's the fundamental architecture of GNH, of gross national happiness. And it has 4 components. One is environmental conservation or resilience and diversity of the environment. And Bhutan has been doing amazing work in this field. It is, I believe, the only country in the world that is not only carbon neutral, but carbon negative. And it's definitely the only country in Asia which has managed to grow its forest coverage in the past 20 years, rather than diminish its forest coverage. And I could go on with many other examples. Then, sustainable and equitable social economic development. So of course, social and economic development is important, but it has to be equitable. It means that it should be inclusive, no one left behind, and sustainable. It means it has to take into consideration not only the well-being of the people who are on Earth today, but also of future generations. And it was very interesting that we also worked with some politicians in Wales, and the Welsh government passed an act called the Well-Being of Future Generation Act, and required from, and they have a future generation commissioner that is in charge to try to assess what the consequences of major political or economic decision will be on future generations. So I think that's a very important, one of the big problems that we have today in Western politics is that most of the decisions are very short term. Most politicians only think until the next election, basically. So 4 years, 5 years. But the impact of political decision and economic decision oftentimes will have impact over generations. So this thinking widely, so equitable and also long-term, is a fundamental factor of a healthy social and economic development. Then the third one is preservation and promotion of culture. And I believe that in the West, little by little, culture has become almost like a subsystem of the economy. Of course, you might say, yes, there are some subsidies for culture and so on, but you know, it's not really considered something very important. And we saw it when the COVID crisis started. I don't know if I think it was the same in Germany, but here in Switzerland, I was in Switzerland when it happened, they said all non-essential activities must stop. And one of the first that stopped were all the cultural activities, considered as non-essential. And I would very much challenge the fact that culture is non-essential. First of all, culture is very wide. It covers both, it covers art, of course, but also science and spirituality. So it's really what gives the very, so to say, the identity of a culture, of a people, of a civilization, of a country. And the fourth one is good governance. And of course, one can speak a very long time about what is good governance, but basically what we are speaking about when we speak of good governance, to put it in a nutshell, is the task of the leadership is to aim for the common good. That's as simple as that. Unfortunately, as we know, most political parties are not really concerned with the common good, but more concerned with specific interests. So this is the basic architecture of gross national happiness, making sure that these 4 pillars are in balance, and this within responsible use of resources. Then you might ask, but how do we know whether the country is going in the right direction? And that's where we developed a system called Gnh Index, which is, instead of only measuring economic development, we measure 9 different domains: ecological diversity and resilience, living standards, health, education, cultural diversity and resilience, community vitality, time balance, good governance, and psychological well-being. So you might have noticed that the 4 pillars are found again in the 9 domains. The difference is that the 4 pillar is like the foundation of gross national happiness, while the 9 domains is what we measure to assess, to ensure that we are going in the right direction. And this again, and that's box number C, within a responsible use of resources. And finally, and that's, I think, unique in Bhutan, is the idea of happiness skills. So that's the inner dimension. So it's not only looking at the outer political, social, structural, organizational dimension, but also looking at the inner dimension of happiness and well-being. So this is like simply a kind of a summary. 4 pillars: sustainable, equitable economic development, preservation of culture, conservation of the environment, good governance, and then 9 domains that are then measured regularly to ensure that we are developing in the right direction. Now, I just want to point out to the fact that Bhutan is not the only country that has started developing well-being indicators. Very prominently, Iceland, New Zealand, Scotland, but also Costa Rica, Ecuador, Sweden, even France, Italy, and the United Kingdom. Although in these 3 last countries, France, Italy, and United Kingdom, I'm not so sure how important these indicators have become in actually modeling public policies or guiding public policies. But in France, for instance, it was Nicolas Sarkozy who commissioned a study on well-being indicators, the so-called Stiglitz-Fitoussi Commission. And their results were very interesting, but I'm not sure that it has really ever been implemented. But definitely 3 countries are in the forefront in the developed world. One is New Zealand, and its Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, who said we need to address the societal well-being of our nation, not just the economic well-being. And if you have followed a little bit Jacinda Ardern's career, you might see that she has really done very interesting steps in this direction. She even has a well-being budget in the yearly budget of the state. So that's a very interesting example how such well-being centered development can also be implemented in a so-called developed country. Another interesting example is Nicola Sturgeon from the First Minister of Scotland, who said the goal of economic policy should be collective well-being, how happy and healthy a population is, not just how wealthy a population is. So you see again the same idea found. And the third one is Katrin Jakobsdottir, the Prime Minister of Iceland, who's been also very prominent in promoting happiness and well-being in her country. You will have noticed that, interestingly enough, the 3 leaders who are really on the forefront of this effort are ladies. Okay, so that was about the structural dimension. Now, I would like to speak very briefly, because that would take a lot of time, about the inner dimensions. So what we call happiness skills. And our understanding of happiness skills has developed a lot because of the progress in the field of neuroscience. What I'm showing you is a reconstruction of the development of the brain, what is called brain plasticity. Now, the good news is, so when I was a student, that was a long time ago because I'm 70 years old now. When I was a student, I was told, yeah, well, you know, this brain plasticity, it stops when you stop growing, more or less, when you're 18 or 20 or something. In reality, now we know, because we can observe it much finer, that brain plasticity can potentially continue throughout our life. Therefore, this is the reason why we can learn throughout our life. But what it's important to be aware of is that in the early years, it's almost like a natural process, while in later years, brain plasticity depends on our inner activity. And there's been a lot of research that has shown that, for instance, inner activities like mindfulness, meditation, contemplation, and more play a prominent role in keeping this brain plasticity alive and creating new pathways in the brain. And now I think there is a much more understanding about the importance of social and emotional learning, social emotional skills. I just this afternoon, I was at the UNESCO in Geneva at the International Bureau of Education to share with them about a program that we are doing that is called Happy Schools, to develop so-called non-cognitive competencies with children. And these social emotional learning, or these social emotional skills, are really the foundation of happiness skills. So self-management, self-awareness, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. And we have developed a whole program to how practically we can develop social emotional skills or social emotional learning, not only with children, but also with adults. And one of the starting points is mindfulness practice. So the ability to direct our attention intentionally. Yes, our ability to direct our attention intentionally. This was a mindfulness session that I did in a gymnasium in southern Germany near Munich. I don't know if you share this with me, but I think it's really very impressive to see the beauty of the human face when it's really still and inward. Of course, they are beautiful because they are young people, but beyond that, I mean, really, you know, just this peace and calmness and presence is something that moves me very deeply each time I see it. So, the core message, what I'm trying to share with you tonight, is when we look at a new development paradigm, we need to find a balance between looking at the inner dimension and the outer dimension. Structural, social, political, economic dimensions, ecological dimensions, but also the inner dimension, a change, a shift in consciousness. Now, for us, it was very important to show that the idea of gross national happiness was not only for countries or governments, but could also be implemented both in the field of business and in the field of education. So I'll give you a few examples. We worked in Thailand with Grimm, which is one of the largest energy provider in Thailand. And now they are the largest renewable energy provider in all of Southeast Asia. We worked with Eileen Fisher, which is a fashion company in the US, which was a pioneer in promoting circular economy in the field of fashion. And if you know a little bit something about that, you know that fashion is one of the great polluters in the world. We've been working with BITIS in Vietnam, which is the largest shoe company, almost 10,000 employees, producing 25 million pair of shoes. And we've been working with them for 4 years now, almost 3.5 years, implementing the ideas of gross national happiness in their company. And now, currently, we are working with SIG in Geneva. This is Service Industriel de Genève, which means that it's the company that provides electricity, water, internet, and waste management for Canton Geneva. So when I speak about implementing gross national happiness in companies, it's looking, again, both inward and outward. So what is the happiness and well-being of the employees, and how can we create within the company conditions that promote happiness and well-being for their own employees? And what is the impact of the company on society and on the environment, and how can we improve the two? So that was Grimm. That it's a very old company. It exists since 1878. And after going through this program, they changed their slogan, which is doing business with compassion for the development of civilization in harmony with nature. So you see, they have tried to include the three dimensions that I mentioned, living in harmony with oneself, so developing compassion, living in harmony with others and society for the development of civilization, and living in harmony with nature. And so these are just a few pictures. That was in 2016. We worked with all the senior managers. In the middle, the European-looking man is the CEO. It's Harald Link, the CEO of the company, and these are all the senior managers. So it was both looking at how can we transform the company to make it more sustainable, more ecological, and also having a better social impact on society and also within the company. And this is an example of mindfulness practices and deep listening, sharing, and so on with senior managers. And these have become then practices that are used throughout the company. This is like a mindfulness practice that they do before starting a meeting in their company, including with blue-collar workers in the factories. So that's just one example. I mean, there would be a lot to say about that, but it's just to show that this idea of gross national happiness can also be very practically implemented in the field of businesses. And then the other field that we're working with is education. So universities in Vietnam, professional school in Thailand, Happy School in Vietnam, Happy School in Switzerland. We have a program at the Geneva Management School and also one in Germany, the Osnabrück University. So these are all programs. Universities are mainly to, it's like ongoing training for professionals who can then develop their understanding and knowledge of gross national happiness and how to implement it in their own context. This is the one in Osnabrück. It's called Die Gestaltungskraft des Glücks. And we are now running the second iteration of this course. It's over about nine months. And this is the one in Geneva, in the Geneva Management School. It's a certificate of advanced studies, and it's called Le Bonheur dans les Organisations, means happiness in organizations. It's a management course. These are some of the pictures of the participants. That's the German group, and that's the Swiss group in the Geneva Management School. Yeah. And then one program that I'm really that is very dear to my heart is the idea of happy schools. We started in Bhutan, then we moved to Vietnam. Now we have a pilot project in Switzerland. As I was mentioning this afternoon, I met with the director of the International Bureau of Education of the UNESCO, and they will become official partners of the Happy School. And there are also some seeds, small seeds in Germany. It's just beginning. We have not yet implemented, but there are a number of teachers have approached us to also do it in Germany. So that's the curriculum that I wrote on Happy School. That was for the Vietnam group. And again, you see these three fundamental modules that we use is self-care, care for others and society, and care for the environment and the planet. So you see it's always the same kind of process. And this is like a mindfulness practice in a primary school, state school in Vietnam. So we are really working with the public sector, public schools, I mean, not private schools. We implement that with the support of the Ministry of Education in public schools in Vietnam. And that was a gymnasium in Germany. And the lady in the wheelchair was one of the teachers who did the training with us in Osnabrück and introduced that then in her classes. Yeah. So as a conclusion, I would like you to reflect for yourself. What does happiness mean for you in your work, in your family, and in society? For the German speakers among you who want to learn more about it, I have a book, I wrote a book that for the time being only exists in German and in Vietnamese, funnily enough, but the American version will be coming out next year. And if you want more information, these are, you can reach me through mail at info@eli. ELI stands for Eurasia Learning Institute for Happiness and Wellbeing.org, and this is our website. And I will end with that so that we still have a little bit of time to share or have an exchange or answer questions.
Thank you, Tho. Let me have a look if we got questions of any. Where are they? Here we go. Actually, we have none. Oh, yes, no, we have none. One question is that will the recording and or the slides of the presentation be available to us? This is recorded and it will go onto our website and the website from Helle Panke. I think it takes about a week's time until it does. It's been edited and is up and running. We'll notify you, of course, with Twitter and Facebook. You can just also look on our website if you'd like. That's all right. Here's the first question. But there was also a reality in Bhutan that violated a lot of people. Same time of implementing the policy of happiness, the citizenship law was passed in 1985, which declared immigrants from Nepal to be illegal immigrants and expelled them from the country. Tens of thousands of displaced Nepalis and the few who remained had for many years to live in poverty and misery. My question to you, how true is leave no one behind? Isn't the human relationship just real for a part of the people in Bhutan, not for all?
Yes, thank you for the question. Yes, I'm very aware of this problematic. And it's very interesting because actually my colleague at the Gross National Happiness Center, Dr. Samdhu Chetri, was himself a Bhutanese of Nepali ethnic Nepalese in Bhutan. So first of all, I think it's important to realize that Bhutan is not a paradise on earth. And it would be very unfair to sort of imagine or believe that, you know, one country has reached perfect happiness or perfect, you know, perfection. But it is a very courageous attempt to develop a country in a different direction than the one that is usually happening. When the young king came to power, he saw what was happening in the neighboring countries and how the so-called modernization, economic development, and so on was bringing some progress, but also a lot of suffering, destroying the environment, the culture, and so on. And he tried to find a different way. Now, concerning the Lotsampa problem, the Lotsampa is the people in the south of Nepalese in the south. We have to see it in a context. The context was that it was in the years where in Nepal there was the Maoist guerrilla. So Nepal was very unstable, and there were a lot of refugees coming from Nepal to Bhutan. And Bhutan is a very small country with a population of about 800,000 people. So it's very small. Sort of the size of the country is comparable with Switzerland, but the population is only one tenth. So 800,000 in Switzerland, we have a little over 8 million. And therefore, this huge influx of Nepali refugees really destabilize the country. And I think there was a real fear for the Bhutanese that it would completely destabilize the country. I think there was up to 100,000 refugees in southern Bhutan in the worst of the crisis. So it's about 1/8 of the population. Now, when we look at what happens in Europe now, the way Europe reacts to refugees, and we're not speaking about 1/8 of, let's say, what is the population of Germany? 80 million or something? I don't know exactly. No, imagine you would have like 10 million refugees coming to Germany. So if I remember well, when Angela Merkel opened the door for a few 100,000, first they were welcome, and then there was a huge outcry. That's well, I don't want to go into German politics, but I'm just trying to put things in perspective. So you see, it's very easy to say, oh, why did not the Bhutanese welcome all the refugees? You know, while we in Europe, who are so much richer and have so much more means, well, now that we have the Afghan crisis, very few countries are really willing to admit a lot of Afghani refugees into European countries. So I'm not trying to say what the Bhutanese government did was good or right. It was definitely problematic, ethically problematic, and it was a bit sad, or it was, yeah, that a country that tries to put happiness and well-being in the center was not able to be a bit more generous than they were. But I think we also have to see it in a context. The second thing is that it's very interesting that when it happened, there was very little international awareness of it, except for, you know, UN agencies and ICRC. You know, I knew it from the ICRC. But then when Bhutan came out with the idea of gross national happiness, then this problem that was long gone, that was past, that was in the 80s, was put up again. And I really felt at that point that it was a kind of a counterattack, you know, like, because I remember one day the Wall Street Journal came out with an article that was where it was written, "Gross national happiness, a bad idea whose time has passed." Because there had been an article, "Gross national happiness, a good idea whose time has come," and then there was a kind of a counter article in the Wall Street Journal. And it is obvious that if the idea of gross national happiness would spread, it would be quite a challenge to the current system, neoliberal economic system. Therefore, there was a very strong counterattack. And when I was in Bhutan, and that the report of the Bhutanese government that was going to be given to the UN, after 2012, and it was the contribution of the royal government of Bhutan to the Sustainable Development Goals. The report was called Happiness and Wellbeing Towards a New Economic Paradigm. And then a delegation from the World Bank came to Bhutan and said to the Prime Minister, I know it because he was my boss, and I was aware of it, and told him, this is not acceptable. We will not allow that you produce an official document that calls for a new economic paradigm. You need to call it a new development paradigm, which is a bit vaguer. So what I'm trying to say is, yes, it was not skillful of the Bhutanese government, and there have been some human tragedies, although, and I know it for sure because of my ICRC connection, because the ICRC was in charge of the refugee camps, it was not at all the ethnic cleansing that has been oftentimes described. So that's number one. So it has been exaggerated. Two, at the time where it happened, it created very little reaction. But later, when Bhutan came up with a development paradigm that was challenging the current order, the economic order, then suddenly this old story was taken up as a kind of an argument to show that Bhutan cannot be taken seriously because they can't manage their own these kind of problems. And thirdly, it's not about Bhutan. It's about the rest of the world. Like Bhutan is just like 800,000 people. So, what's the impact of Bhutan in the world? It's almost nothing. Even, okay, we say Bhutan is carbon negative, great. But, even if it was emitting some CO, some carbon, it would be nothing compared with, don't forget, it's squeezed between China and India. So I think we are focusing on the wrong question if we are trying to pick on Bhutan. The question is, what are we here in Europe, for instance? Who are the greatest polluters, together, of course, with China and US and so on? What are we doing to transform the system in such a way that it's more focused on happiness and well-being, on preservation of the environment, and so on? So I think, of course, one can discuss and argue about whether Bhutan has done it well or not so well also. But I think the greater question is about looking at what we are doing and how we can improve.
All right, the next question is, how will governments, states, decide on the exact variable that should measure the 9 goals? What examples are existing for that? So again, what exactly could or will be part of the measurable variables?
Yes, thank you. So, of course, that's quite a lengthy and complex question. But basically, so for instance, if you speak German, you can look up in my book. I've written down the variables that are used in Bhutan. But I don't think that the goal is to copy paste the variables that are used in Bhutan to do the same in here, because so there's 3 levels. There are 9 domains. So first of all, are these 9 domains the most relevant domains? So that's the what Bhutan came up with. And so far, when I've been using it in Europe, being it in in various contexts, usually the 9 domains appear to be quite relevant. Now, what are the indicators that we use to measure these domains? This has to be contextualized. So for instance, when we implement gross national happiness in an organization or in a business, for instance, then a lot of the work is to co-create the indicators together with the people, because the indicators have to reflect the reality of the context. And then from the indicators, you go to the variables, which are the questions that are asked in the survey, for instance, which is then, it's like basic, survey statistic and social science knowledge, where you try out and then you pre-test and all of that. But basically in Bhutan, what has been done is a mix of objective and subjective measures. For instance, when we measure psychological well-being, there is a mix of subjective questions where people just self-report, and then a number of objective questions like, or let's say health is easier than when we take health. Then we have subjective questions such as if people feel healthy, if they feel they have an energy, and so on and so forth. And then objective question as how many days they have been sick in the year and things like that. So it's always a mix of objective and subjective indicators that are used. And then basically it's survey technique, so to like survey. But again, what is really important is to contextualize the indicators so that the indicators truly reflect the reality of the context, being it an organization, a school, a business, a city, a country, and so on. So there's no ready-made answer. These are the variables, these are the indicators, but it's the process of constructing the indicators and constructing the survey is it itself a very important and helpful process, because it helps us reflect what do we think is important. Because that's really, you know, it must connect with the reality of the people's experience. Otherwise, it's just one more project coming from above.
All right. Could you give an example of concrete implementation or preparation of happiness principles in factories or universities?
Yes. So in factories or universities, two very different things. In factories, let's say now we're working with the Service Industriel de Genève in Geneva. This is what I mentioned. This. So we're working on different levels. One, the organization has sent a number of their managers to follow this 1-year course in the Geneva Management School, so that we have a number of managers that are trained in both happiness skills and implementing gross national happiness in their organization, so that we have what we call gross national happiness ambassadors within the organization. So that's one level. It's sort of creating a certain management culture. The other dimension is we are working with the senior leadership. In this case, it's the group, the Direction Générale, so all the directors of the different departments, on rethinking or redefining the vision, the mission, the values that they want to put at the heart of the work of their organization. And through that, then developing together with them, as I've just mentioned, the survey indicators that we will use to assess the impact of the organization, both internally on the well-being of their own employees and externally on society and on environment. And then this Gnh survey with the 9 domains will enable us to identify where are the fields where the company is already doing well and can continue or even improve, and where are the fields where the company needs to transform or change or improve, make maybe significant changes. So it is, if you want, there's a top-down and bottom-up movement that come together. The bottom-up is really trying to have a positive impact on the management culture, on the culture of the company, so that these ideas of happiness and well-being and happiness skills and so on are ingrained in the company culture. So one practical example is that they have introduced what they call trust-based management, where the number of hours that people work is not controlled anymore, so that people can self-organize their work, and it's just the objectives that are controlled and not not how many hours or stamping. And that was very interesting because we introduced that before the COVID crisis came, and then when the COVID crisis came and all of the people working in management and offices and so on had to stay home and did not show up to work anymore, then it was very easy because the organization was already used to work on a trust-based management and not checking whether you arrive at 9 o'clock or 8 o'clock or whatever in your office and at what time you leave and things like that. So that was interesting that the COVID crisis actually confirmed that this kind of management was very helpful. Another example in the field of business is that when we're working I mentioned we're working with a company in Vietnam, which is called BITIS. It's a very large shoe company. And so many of the workers are factory workers. And of course, for them, if we came and make discourses on happiness and well-being and indicators and frameworks, I mean, it didn't mean anything to them. But what we did is we did the Gnh survey in the company. and we identified what were the problems that the workers were facing. So many of the workers in the factories are women, and many of them come from the countryside, and it's their first time having employed job and a fixed salary and working in a factory. And so they were facing several problems. One problem was, for instance, education, the right balance, time balance for the kids, and also moving from a rural context where education was very traditional and where it was extended family who took care of the children, to urban context where suddenly there's, just a father, mother, and a few kids in an apartment. And the parents, the young mothers often felt quite helpless. So we offered free courses on early childhood education with pediatrician and teachers and so on. And the workers were allowed to go and follow this course during working hours. Another problem that we identified was, how do you deal with a salary? So, as I said, many of them had lived in the countryside where there was relatively little money involved. And then suddenly they're in the city and they have to learn how to live with a salary, fixed salary. And many of them got into debt. And in Vietnam, when you borrow money, you still have to, the interest rate is very high, 9, 10, or 11%. So if you get into debt, you're soon in big trouble. And so we offered courses on, basic family economic household management, something like that. So you see, the 9 domains enabled us to identify fields where the workers were facing difficulties and where we could try to improve their situation, so that for them, the happiness project, it's called Happy BITIS, the project, is not something abstract that's only for the senior management, very abstract, but it really changes something in their daily lives. So on one hand, we were working with senior management, how to improve the ecological dimension of the factory and things like that. But on the other hand, we were working on a very practical implementation for the factory workers, so that they would actually see an improvement in their daily life. So that's in business. In the field of education, there's 2 very different things. One is having university courses like the one in Geneva Management School or the one in Osnabrück, which is basically offering a curriculum in gross national happiness. But that does not necessarily really transform the whole institution. And the other one is working with schools, like the Happy School project that we have in Vietnam, and that now we have in Switzerland, implementing in Switzerland, where we really try to have an impact on the very, the way the school is functioning, meaning that besides academic skills, a real emphasis or attention is put on social and emotional learning, on mindfulness, on these so-called happiness skills that are then included in the curriculum. And the way to do that is first for the teachers to experience it for themselves. And because if they notice that it improves their own well-being, then it's much easier to have them also implement it with their students.
All right. Next question. Thanks for the talk. My question is, how is the interest of companies in making the highest profit affecting an effective transformation to G&H? And do we rather need a post-growth or non-capitalist society for that?
Well, you see, I believe that when we want to bring about change, we have to look at it from 2 different perspectives. One, it is very, very helpful to have like small pilot projects where you can really try to implement fully. Let's say in the field of education, it's much easier to have a private school, and we also work with some private schools, that is free to do whatever they want, and then they can really go, fully into a change of paradigm. Or you can have a small company, that is more like a startup, and that from the beginning is a social enterprise with a strong ecological, social, and so on impact. So of course, that's very important. These are what I call seeds of the future. So, so that we can see, yeah, it's possible, even if it's on small scale, but it's possible. The other thing is that for the time being, the majority of mankind, of humankind, are working in the current system. So, in big organizations or in large public school systems and so on. And for me in Vietnam, for instance, it was very important to put my attention rather on the public school system than on private schools, because in the private schools, anyway, it's more the privileged kids that would go there, while the public school is where the average kids are going. And in Vietnam, we have about, I think, 30 million kids in school. And obviously, it's impossible to create enough special or also private school for 30 million kids, and nobody can afford that. But if we can have even if it's a smaller impact on the lives of many children, that's already something. And likewise, it's great to have a small, social enterprise that is really doing full circular economy and so on and so forth. But the reality is that the majority of the people work in normal companies. And, if we want to wait until a total change of system, then we might not do anything. While with this approach, we can start working where there is at least willingness to do. Of course, not every company will be willing to implement gross national happiness. But I've been surprised, happily or positively surprised, to observe that many more companies were interested in implementing it than one would think, because in the end, it's about people. And it always goes through personal relationship, that you meet someone and because, managers and even CEOs, they're also people. And, I think that much more people than we think have actually a good intention, are not always able to manifest their good intention, but because many people are also victims of the system. But, if given a chance, many people, including in the business world, are happy if they can feel that what they do is not only making money, but also making a positive contribution to society. This being said, I'm not naive, and I know that there's a lot of companies that are really only profit driven and really don't care about the environment and all the rest of it. Of course it exists, but my contribution is a very modest one. I don't think that I can change the world, but I can try to help one company at a time, one school at a time, so I do my best. That's all I can do.
All right, thanks, very interesting. You mentioned 9 dimensions of measuring happiness. Can you please elaborate a bit more on some of the indicators and how they are weighted for the overall happiness indicator?
Yeah, well, we already had this question, right? And as I said, that's a very big topic. I don't think that I can give really a satisfactory answer to that within a few minutes, because it's quite a complex, statistical structure. So basically, a few things I would like to say. One is very interesting, is that we don't weight the 9 domains. So 9 domains are considered equally important. So there's not one more important than the other one. That's the one thing. The other thing is, which is very interesting and quite unique to gross national happiness, is the idea of sufficiency threshold. So the goal is not, let's say, if you measure from, let's say, 1 to 10, the goal is not to have 10 everywhere. But the goal is to reach a sufficiency threshold that we usually put at around 6. Because the idea is that the various domains are interdependent. Let me give you a very simple example. Let's say if you use the 9 domains to assess your own personal life, which you can do. I mean, you know, we have a variation of the 9 domains matrix that we use for self-assessment. So let's say if you want to have 10 everywhere, so maximum everywhere, which is very much the, you know, Western capitalistic kind of approach, the more the better in every field, the more the better, which is not the GNH approach. GNH approach is more Buddhist one, like the balanced middle way, you know. So let's say you want to have both 10 in time use is one of the dimensions, right? And 10 in income, right? Usually the two will contradict. So if you want to earn more, usually you will have less time for something else because you will have to put a lot of your time into work, for instance. And then another one is a community vitality. Yeah. So in order to have community vitality, you need to invest time in relationships, in your community, in your family, whatever. So there is an interdependence between income, time use, community vitality. And the question is not how can I have the maximum everywhere, but for me, where is the right balance? You see? So I'm just giving 3 examples, but it's true for all 9. So, you know, where is the right balance? For instance, you know, income usually means consuming more. If I consume more, usually it will have a negative impact on the planet. So I have to balance between consumption and ecological resilience, and so on. So the idea of the interdependence of the 9 domains and the sufficiency threshold is a very interesting perspective that doesn't seek to have maximum everywhere, but tries to reflect how much is enough in each one of the fields. And again, as I was saying, this how much is enough has to be contextualized. We cannot generalize it. You know, for each context, how much is enough will be different. The more technical part of it, you know, you would have to read it up because that's a long, you know, which indicators, which variables, how do we measure them, and so on.
Sorry, Elizabeth, you've posted another question about the Nepalese. I'm going to pass it over for the moment because we have other questions. This is not an event, it's not a talk about what happened 40 years ago. So I'm going to push it to the back. This is something, you know, as an editor of a website, you sometimes have to do. It may sound very, very unfair and whatever, but I'm going to do it because I'd like to get on. You've had a lengthy answer, and I'd just like to get on to what this is actually about. So, as I said, if we can get to it later, we shall. So, next question. Thanks for the talk. My question is, how is the... Wait, we've had this, sorry. How do we run? Some years ago, I've seen a film about the methods and the questions to find out how happy the people are and how much they contribute to the happiness for all. What do you think about the risk of people being monitored by the surveys and coming under pressure, for example, with the social points in China?
Yep. Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. And I think one has to be very careful about it. So it's not about monitoring individuals or groups, definitely not. It's about trying to assess whether society as a whole is going in a certain direction. So the Gnh survey in Bhutan is anonymous. So no one knows who has answered what. It's a completely anonymous survey. What we can read out of, and if you look on internet, you can read the outcome of the last survey that was done, I think 2 years ago, if I remember correctly. Then you will see it's just general tendency. For instance, let me give you an example. we can see that economic development has picked up. But so it has increased. But on the other hand, for instance, community vitality has decreased. And so you become aware of the fact that every, again, the interdependence of the 9 domains, so that you become aware of the fact that if you only look at one indicator, like let's say economic development, then you might take decisions that will have negative impact on other domains like community vitality or environment, and not be aware of it because you only monitor one aspect, which is economic development. But when you monitor in a holistic way the different indicators, then you realize that progress in one field is paid in another one. And then you can try to balance out, how much economic development do we want versus protection of nature versus community vitality versus time use and so on. So I think that's really the idea, and not to monitor individuals or groups to see whether they bring happiness to the society or something like that. And that's the first thing. And the second thing is, as I said, the idea is not to predetermine what people should do or not do to be happy. It's really to create conditions that should enable people to thrive and develop and as much as possible, So, but what each individual or group of individuals has as his own or her own understanding of happiness, this is not prescribed by government and shouldn't be prescribed by government, also not by management in a factory or something like that. So it's very important, because it would definitely be very worrying if we had the feeling that the government sort of mixes in and tells us how we should be happy, or what happiness should be for us, and something like that. So kind of a happiness dictatorship or something. And the example of the social points in the Chinese regime is a very good example of this problematic.
So the next question is, I'm going to rephrase it. When you do work in a company introducing Gnh, are these companies with unions? And if so, how are the unions? What is their reaction? How is their participation in a Gnh program?
Yeah, so for instance, in Switzerland, in SIG, yes, of course, they have a union, and they have a representative of the unions that are from the beginning involved in the process. Because if we say that we want to try to improve the well-being of the workforces, obviously their representative should be involved in the process and have their voice and tell us what they see as the priorities in these processes. In some countries, I know it from France, for instance, the problem that we sometimes have with unions is that they have very one-sided kind of perspective. So it's always about more money and less work kind of thing, which is understandable, but it's also a very narrow perspective on what could really increase the well-being of the people and the companies. But here in Switzerland, I must say, the collaboration with the representative of the workers and unions is quite positive and fruitful and helpful, because they have a more direct access to the workforce, to the employees, and therefore it's very helpful to know what are the problems that the employees are facing, what are the questions that they have, what are the wishes, what are the improvements that they are looking for. Because again, for a Gnh project to be successful, it should be inclusive and it should be participatory. It should not be just a top-down kind of imposition.
So I'm just going to do half of this question because I don't understand. The first part isn't a question, but the second part is very, very interesting. I don't know if you know it. Is there some connection between GNH and the donut economy from Kate Raworth?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So I think that in order to implement GNH, we have to have an approach that is exactly the same than the one of the donut economy. So which is, this middle ground, again, the middle ground that is neither destroying the environment nor neglecting legitimate human needs. And this middle part, the donut part, which is the balance part where basic human needs are met without destroying the environment, is exactly the same as the GNH approach. So I would say, donut economy is very similar in the German-speaking world. The what is it called? Economy for the common good, Gemeinwohlökonomie. Yeah, is also a very similar approach, or it has similarities. Definitely GNH is not alone. There are luckily many other approaches, and I think these approaches are all very compatible.
So I'm going to ask a question. We've done a lot of talks about degrowth. We've posted immense number of articles, videos, and whatever. And I always have a feeling with the term "a better life." This is what degrowth promises, and it always seems to get a bit stuck at that point. What is a better life? And my impression is, what you've included in your talk is a spiritual element, which is not really. I think degrowth is, maybe I'm being unfair, but a bit shy about that, about the spiritual quality of a better life. You're working in Europe and in Asia. Do you notice any differences there about the question of spirituality as part of happiness?
Well, it depends where in Asia. Of course, Bhutan is a Buddhist country, and Bhutan is a country that has never been colonized. Therefore, the traditional Bhutanese Buddhist culture is still very strong. And it's very easy in Bhutan to use Buddhist terminology and Buddhist approaches, to convey messages to people. So that was in GNH in Bhutan, although the way it's formulated is quite secular, but of course it's very aligned with Buddhist values. For instance, the idea that, in Buddhism, one of the ideas is that greed and desire is a source of suffering, while the whole consumerism is based on the idea that happiness equals more consumption, so more desire. So of course, GNH society is not a society of mindless consumption. So that's in Bhutan, it's very easy to convey this idea based on Buddhist values. And also the idea of happiness skills is very aligned with the idea of training the mind, which is one of the fundamental idea in Buddhist tradition. This being said, as soon as we work outside of Bhutan, we have to find secular way to convey the same ideas, even in Asia, because Vietnam is a communist country and we cannot do anything that would feel like it's religious. So although Vietnam has a Buddhist tradition, but it is a communist country, and it's been a communist country for many years now. And of course, a communist government is quite reluctant to let anything that feels religious, especially in the education, for instance. So we really need to address a deeper layer, so to say, in a non-religious way. And then, of course, when we work in Europe, let's say in Switzerland, I mean, Geneva is Calvinistic. So it has a tradition, Calvinistic tradition, but it's actually very secular, like most of Europe. And of course, also, if we teach in universities, we have to be able to address a deeper dimension without making it sound religious or too spiritual, because that would not be acceptable. I think what really helps is now that we have a lot of scientific evidence about for instance, the impact of mind training like meditation, mindfulness, and so on. There's been a lot of research on that, including in Germany. The Max Planck Institute has conducted a very large research called the Resource Project in, I think it was in, no, I'm not sure in which city, but it was anyway the Max Planck Institute. You can look it up in internet. It's called Resource Project. It was Dr. Tanya Singer who was in charge of this project. That was maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And there are many more examples. So that we do have a lot of scientific evidence that shows that what you could call a more inner dimension, like, emotional, taking into account the emotional dimension and things like that. We don't have to necessarily bring it from a spiritual or religious perspective. We can really bring it from a more scientific perspective. And what I've experienced, and I've been teaching a lot of courses on GNH in many, many different countries, is that mostly there's a lot of openness for that. And that many people somehow feel this kind of shallowness of materialism is, it's not really satisfactory. And many people are looking for a deeper dimension, whatever you want to call it, not necessarily religious, but somehow a deeper dimension or a higher dimension in their lives. So so far, I haven't really found a lot of difficulties with that. It's more finding the right words so that it doesn't, somehow shock or give the feeling we're trying to impose something or to convert someone to any kind of whatever, to Buddhism or whatever.
Thank you. The last question. No, there's 2 more questions. Have there been kindergartens that implement these ideas, or only elementary schools? Wait, there's a second part. I ask as an Erzieher in Leipzig, and I suppose I'm curious as to the application with younger minds.
Yes, absolutely. We were working in actually one of our first partner was a school in Thimphu in Bhutan that was called Early Learning Center, ELC, Early Learning Center. So it was like preschool, and there were some of the first one to implement ideas or so-called happiness skills within the kindergarten and then later in primary school. And my own daughter is actually a pediatrician in Geneva, and she's the head of the Department for Child Development. And she has been doing a lot of research on social emotional learning, mindfulness, and other such practices on young children, and especially also on young children who were born premature, because that's her field of research. And she's been publishing actually quite a few articles on that. So yes, there are some experiences, some practices, and also some scientific data behind the work, even with young children. Absolutely.
All right, it's almost 1/4 to. I'm going to end this now. So let me go through. First of all, thank you very, very much, Tho, that you've taken your evening to present GNH. This is, there's been a lot of discussion about GDP being absolutely obsolete in the meantime, and the question is what to replace it with, and what would it look like concretely. I'd also like to thank Florian and Oscar for translating, and once again Helle Panke and Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung for making this possible. We're going to continue on this more practical plane with the next event, which is on the 9th of November, again at 8 p.m. CET, with Robin McAlpine. He's from the Think and Do tank in Scotland called Commonweal, and it's just an incredible what they've accomplished. They've more or less worked out plans for every sector of the Scottish society, be it in the economic, be it in education, be it in transport and whatever, to develop a a zero carbon emission society, but also a healthy, happy society, very much similar to what Do has described. And then we have Julia Steinberg on the 24th of November, also at 8 p.m. CET, whose topic will be living well within planetary limits. Is it possible? And what will it take? So we invite you to rejoin us then, and hope to see you on the 9th of November. And once again, thank you very, very much. And Elizabeth, sorry about leaving out that one question. All right, good night, everyone, and thank you.
Bye-bye.